Today was the day she would become Mrs. Julian Vane, a name that tasted like ash in her mouth. In the reflection, her mother's hands were steady as she adjusted the delicate veil. "You look breathtaking, Lena. This union, it saves us. Your father's legacy, the company, it's all secure now." Elena didn't look at her. She looked at the bruises on her own soul. Julian Vane wasn't just a businessman. He was a shark who had systematically dismantled her father's life's work just to corner her into this room. He didn't want a wife, he wanted a trophy he could break. "He's waiting," her mother whispered, a plea hidden in the words. Elena took a breath, the corset tightening around her ribs until it hurt to inhale. She walked toward the heavy oak doors, each step echoing through the hollow hallway of her childhood home. When the doors opened, the fragrance of 1,000 lilies hit her, cloying and suffocating. At the end of the aisle stood Julian. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with a proprietary glint. He didn't smile as she approached. He simply reached out, his fingers cold as they closed around her gloved hand, pulling her toward the altar. "You're late," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver of pure loathing down her spine. "I was savoring my last moments of freedom," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet sharp enough to draw blood. The priest began to speak, the ancient words of commitment falling on deaf ears. Elena looked at the stained glass, praying for a storm big enough to wash the whole chapel away. But the ceremony marched on. When it came time for the vows, Julian spoke his with a chilling clarity, his gaze never leaving hers. It wasn't a promise, it was a command. When the ring slid onto her finger, it felt like a shackle. "I do," she forced out, the words feeling like a betrayal of everything she was. The reception was a blur of forced smiles and champagne that tasted like vinegar. Julian kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, a constant reminder of his ownership. Every time someone congratulated them on their fairy tale romance, Elena felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. As the night deepened, the guests began to thin. The grand ballroom, once filled with music, grew quiet, leaving only the sound of the wind outside. Julian leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "It's time to go home, Elena." The drive to his secluded estate was silent. Elena stared out at the passing trees, her mind racing. She had a plan, a small flicker of defiance she was nursing in the dark. She wouldn't be his victim. If he wanted a war, she would give him one. When they arrived, the house loomed over them, a fortress of glass and steel. Julian led her inside, the lights flickering on to reveal a minimalist interior that felt as cold as its owner. He turned to her, stripping off his suit jacket. "You can drop the act now," he said, his expression unreadable. "There are no cameras here." "I never had an act, Julian. I hate you. I think I've made that clear." He took a step toward her, his presence overwhelming. "Hate is a strong emotion, Elena. It's almost as exhausting as love. I suggest you find a way to live with it. You aren't leaving." He walked toward the master suite, leaving her standing in the center of the vast, empty living room. Elena looked at the heavy gold band on her finger. This was only the beginning. She went to the window, looking out at the dark horizon. She had lost the battle of the wedding, but the war for her life was just starting. Hours later, the house was silent. Elena lay awake in the guest room she had retreated to, the silk sheets feeling like sandpaper against her skin. She heard a soft floorboard creak in the hallway. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The door handle turned slowly. Julian stood in the doorway, framed by the moonlight. He didn't enter, but his shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her. "I don't like being defied, Elena. Remember that." He closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the stillness. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, married to the man who had destroyed her world. But as she closed her eyes, she whispered a vow of her own, one that the priest hadn't prompted. She would find his weakness, and when she did, she would burn his empire to the ground. The first week in the Vane mansion was a study in silence. Julian was a ghost during the day, leaving for the city before the sun touched the garden, and returning long after Elena had retreated to her room. But his presence was everywhere, in the way the staff looked at her with pity, and in the expensive gifts that appeared on her vanity. A diamond tennis bracelet, a silk robe the color of a bruised plum. Elena didn't touch them. She spent her days exploring the house, looking for a crack in Julian's armor. She found it on a Tuesday afternoon in the back of his library. Hidden behind a row of leather-bound law books was a locked drawer. It wasn't the jewelry or the money she cared about. It was the leverage. She was kneeling on the floor, picking at the lock with a hairpin, when the shadow fell over her. Looking for something, Mrs. Vane? Elena froze. Julian stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, looking exhausted but predatory. He didn't move to stop her. He just watched, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "I'm looking for the truth," she snapped, standing up and brushing the dust from her skirt. "Why me, Julian? You could have had any woman in the city. Why go through the trouble of destroying my father just to force me into a ring?" Julian walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. He stopped only inches away, so close she could smell the expensive bourbon and the sharp scent of cedar on his skin. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a gesture that felt like both a caress and a threat. "Because," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "you're the only thing your father ever truly loved. Taking his company was business. Taking you, that was personal." Elena's blood turned to ice. "What did he do to you?" Julian's eyes darkened, a flash of raw pain crossing his face before the mask slammed back into place. "That is a story for another night. For now, put on the dress I sent up. We have a gala to attend. If you're going to hate me, Elena, you'll do it while looking like the most envied woman in the room." The gala was a battlefield of flashing bulbs and fake laughter. Elena played her part, her hand resting on Julian's arm like a delicate bird trapped in a snare. But as the night wore on, she noticed something. Julian wasn't looking at the business moguls or the cameras. He was watching a man across the room, Marcus Thorne, her father's former partner. The look in Julian's eyes wasn't just hatred, it was recognition. When they returned home that night, the tension in the car was thick enough to choke. As they stepped into the foyer, Elena grabbed his arm, forcing him to face her. "It wasn't my father, was it? It was Thorne. My father was just the collateral damage." Julian pulled his arm away, his expression hardening. "Go to bed, Elena." "No. You ruined my life for a grudge against the wrong man," she screamed, her voice echoing off the marble walls. In an instant, Julian's composure snapped. He pinned her against the wall, not with violence, but with an intensity that took her breath away. His hands were on either side of her head, his eyes burning into hers. "Your father knew," Julian hissed. "He watched what Thorne did to my family and he stayed silent for a paycheck. He sold his soul and I simply bought the debt. You think I'm the villain? Look at the man who raised you." He let go of her abruptly, his chest heaving. For the first time, Elena saw the cracks in the monster. He wasn't just a man who hated her. He was a man who was drowning in a past she knew nothing about. As he turned to walk away, Elena felt a shift in the air. The lines had blurred. She still hated him for what he'd done to her freedom, but she was starting to realize that they were both victims of the same ghosts. "Julian," she called out softly. He stopped but didn't turn around. "What if I help you?" He looked back over his shoulder, a cynical laugh escaping his lips. "Help me do what?" "Destroy Thorne. The man who actually did it." Julian stared at her for a long time, the silence stretching between them. Then he took a step back toward her, the moonlight catching the silver in his watch. "And what would you want in exchange?" Elena stepped forward, her heart racing. "My freedom. Once Thorne is gone, the marriage is annulled. I get my life back and you get your revenge." Julian reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was different this time, slower, more deliberate. "Deal," he whispered. "But be careful, Elena. When you dance with the devil, you don't get to choose when the music stops." The alliance was a cold, sharp thing like a blade kept in a velvet drawer. For the next month, the Sterling estate transformed from a prison into a war room. By day, they were the perfect, brooding power couple of the city's social elite. By night, they sat in Julian's study, surrounded by digital ledgers and old newspaper clippings, tracing the rot that Marcus Thorne had left in his wake. Elena sat across from Julian, the glow of the laptop illuminating the hollows of her cheeks. She was looking at a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, one her father had signed off on years ago. "My father was a coward," she whispered, the realization finally sinking in. "He didn't hurt your family, Julian. He just watched it happen because he was afraid to lose his status." Julian didn't look up from his own screen, but his voice softened. "Cowardice does more damage than malice ever could, Elena. Thorne pulled the trigger, but your father bought the bullets." She looked at him, really looked at him. The man she hated was exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes and his usual sharp posture was slumped. For the first time she didn't see the shark who had swallowed her life. She saw a boy who had lost everything and spent 20 years trying to claw it back. "Why the marriage then?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If you knew he was just a bystander, why take it out on me?" Julian finally looked up. His dark eyes caught hers and for a heartbeat the air in the room vanished. "I thought if I had the thing he valued most he'd finally break his silence. I thought seeing you in my house under my name would force him to confess what Thorne did to my father." "And did it?" "No," Julian said, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "He just took the payout I gave him and moved to the coast. He didn't even look back at you on the wedding day." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of two people realized they were both abandoned by the same man. Elena felt a strange, traitorous heat behind her eyes. She reached across the desk, her fingers hovering over Julian's hand before she pulled back. "We have enough," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "Thorne is laundering the Vane family's old assets through a real estate firm in the North End. If we leak this to the feds tomorrow, he's done." Julian nodded, but he didn't look happy. He looked empty. "The music is about to stop, Elena. You'll have your annulment by the end of the week." The next morning the scandal broke. The headlines were a frenzy of Thorne's fall from grace and the Vane vengeance. By noon Thorne was in handcuffs. By evening Elena's father had vanished into a bottle of scotch, refusing her calls. Elena stood in the center of her bedroom, the ivory wedding dress she had arrived in packed away in a box. Her suitcases were lined up by the door. The house was strangely quiet. The war was over. She had won her freedom. She walked down the grand staircase one last time. Julian was standing by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked formal, distant, and devastatingly lonely. "The papers are on the table," he said without turning around. "Signed and witnessed. You're free, Elena. The Sterling name is cleared and Thorne is in a cell." Elena walked to the table. The pen was heavy in her hand. All she had to do was scrawl her name and she could walk out the door and never see the man she hated again. She looked at the signature line, then back at Julian's broad shoulders. "You're not going to say goodbye?" she asked. Julian turned then. His expression was a mask of cold indifference, but his hands were clenched at his sides. "I kept my end of the bargain. There's nothing left to say." "You're a liar," Elena said, her voice growing steady. She walked toward him, stopping only when she was inches away. "You spent years hating my family and a month working with me. You don't want me to sign those papers any more than I do." Julian's eyes flared with a sudden violent hunger. "Don't play games, Elena. You've spent every breath since the wedding telling me how much you loathe the sight of me." "I did," she whispered, her hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the frantic rhythm of his heart. "But the man I hated was a shadow. The man I've spent the last month with, he's something else entirely." Julian grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. "I'm still the man who forced you into this. I'm still the man who took your life away." "Then give it back to me," she challenged, her eyes locked on his. "Not as a prisoner. Not as a trophy. But as yours." The glass in Julian's hand hit the hearth, shattering into 1,000 pieces. He pulled her to him, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that tasted of desperation, wine, and a decade of suppressed longing. It wasn't the kiss of a husband and wife. It was the collision of two enemies who had realized they were the only two people in the world who understood one another. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching. I can't let you stay for revenge anymore, Elena. If you stay, it has to be for me. Elena looked at the suitcases by the door, then back at the man who had started as her nightmare and become her sanctuary. She reached out and took the annulment papers from the table, slowly ripping them down the middle. I think, she said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips, we should start the honeymoon. For real this time. Outside, the rain had stopped, and for the first time in the Vane mansion, the silence didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a beginning. 6 months later, the Sterling Vane estate no longer felt like a fortress of secrets. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced with sheer linen that let the morning sun spill across the breakfast table, illuminating a life that neither Elena nor Julian had ever dared to imagine. Elena sat in the sun-drenched library, her laptop open, but her eyes were fixed on the garden. Julian was there, his sleeves rolled up, speaking animatedly on his phone while he walked the perimeter. He looked lighter. The predatory edge had softened into a quiet, focused strength. He wasn't hunting anymore, he was building. He looked up, caught her watching him through the glass, and a slow, genuine smile broke across his face. He ended the call and stepped through the French doors. You're staring again, he murmured, leaning over the back of her chair. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his scent, now a comforting mix of rain and expensive espresso, enveloping her. I'm observing, she corrected, tilting her head back to look at him. It's a strange thing, Julian. To wake up and not feel the need to check for exits. He pulled a chair close, his expression turning serious. I spent so long making sure you couldn't leave that I forgot to give you a reason to stay. I'm still learning how to do that. You're doing fine, she said, her fingers tangling with his. Their new life wasn't a perfect fairy tale. There were still echoes of the past, the way Elena would stiffen when she heard her father's name on the news, or the way Julian's eyes would turn cold when he saw a reminder of Marcus Thorne's trial. But they shared those burdens now. They were no longer two people trapped in a room, they were a team. The board meeting is at 2, Julian reminded her, checking his watch. They still don't know what to make of us. The man who stole the company and the daughter who helped him run it. Let them wonder, Elena laughed. It keeps them on their toes. Besides, I think they're more afraid of me than they are of you now. As they should be, Julian said, his eyes gleaming with pride. That afternoon, they walked into the Vane Sterling headquarters hand in hand. The glass and steel lobby went silent as they passed. They weren't the forced marriage scandal of the year anymore. They were a powerhouse. Elena took her seat at the head of the conference table, right beside Julian. As the meeting commenced, Elena felt a vibration in her pocket. A text from an unknown number. She glanced down. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm at the docks. I'm leaving for good. Don't look for me. Father. She stared at the screen for a long beat. The old Elena would have felt a hole rip through her chest. But this Elena looked at the man sitting next to her. The man who had seen her at her darkest and loved her anyway. She deleted the message and placed the phone face down. Julian reached under the table, squeezing her hand briefly. He didn't need to ask. He knew. When the meeting ended and the sun began to set over the city skyline, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse office. The wind whipped Elena's hair, but she didn't feel cold. What are you thinking about? Julian asked, pulling her back against his chest. I was thinking about the day of the wedding, she admitted. About how much I wanted to watch this city burn. Julian turned her around in his arms, his gaze intense. And now? Elena looked out at the lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars across the horizon. She looked at the ring on her finger, no longer a shackle but a promise of her own making. Now, she whispered, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like victory and peace. I think I'd rather watch it shine. The screen fades to black as the sound of the city hums in the background, leaving the listeners with the ultimate realization. Sometimes the person who destroys your world is the only one who can help you build a better one. The celebration was elegant. A quiet dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor to mark 6 months since the annulment papers were shredded. Julian looked relaxed, the sharp lines of his face softened by the candlelight. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I have something for you," he murmured. "A gift. Not like the ones before. This one is a choice." He slid a small antique velvet box across the white linen. Elena opened it expecting a diamond. Instead she found a heavy rusted iron key. It looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon, not a modern estate. "What is this, Julian?" "My grandfather's hunting lodge in the Blackwood Forest," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "The place where the Vane family fortune truly started, and where my father spent his last days. I've never stepped foot inside since I was 10 years old. I want us to go there. Together. To clear out the ghosts before we start our own family." Elena felt a strange chill despite the warmth of the restaurant. The ghosts. Just memories, Elena. Or so I thought. 2 days later, the gravel of the long-abandoned driveway crunched under the tires of Julian's SUV. The lodge was a Gothic nightmare of gray stone and strangling ivy, isolated by miles of dense timber. As Julian turned the iron key in the massive front door, the wood groaned in protest. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine and something metallic. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights. Julian led her through the grand hall, pointing out portraits of stern-faced men who shared his dark eyes. "I'll start a fire," Julian said, heading toward the hearth. "The cellar has the aged brandy. Stay here, I'll be right back." Elena wandered toward a heavy tapestry on the far wall. Something felt off. The house didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath. She pulled back the edge of the tapestry and gasped. Behind the fabric was a door. Not a grand one, but a small reinforced steel door with a modern keypad. Her heart began to gallop. Why would a ruined hunting lodge have a high-tech security door? He tried the handle. Locked. She looked around the room and spotted Julian's discarded coat on a chair. She checked the pockets and found a small leather notebook. Inside, scribbled in her father's frantic, shaky handwriting, was a series of numbers. Why did her father have the code to Julian's family lodge? She punched the numbers into the keypad. The door hissed open, revealing a staircase leading deep underground. Elena descended, the air turning colder with every step. At the bottom she found a room that looked like a high-end surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, flickering with grainy black and white footage. She stepped closer to the main screen. Her breath hitched. The footage was from the Sterling estate, the house she grew up in. It showed her bedroom, her father's study, the garden. And the timestamps, they were from last week. "Elena." Julian's voice echoed down the stairs, but it wasn't the voice of the man she had fallen in love with. It was flat. She turned around as Julian stepped into the light of the basement. He wasn't holding brandy. He was holding a file folder, aged and yellowed. "I told you my father died here," Julian said softly, stepping into the room. "But I didn't tell you how. He didn't lose his money to Thorne, Elena. He didn't lose it to your father." He tossed the file onto the desk. Elena opened it. Inside were photographs of a third man, a man she recognized from her childhood. Her uncle, the one who had supposedly died in a car accident 20 years ago. "The marriage wasn't just about revenge against your father," Julian whispered, coming to stand right behind her. "It was the only way to get you into this house. The only way to get the final piece of the code." Elena backed away, her spine hitting the cold monitors. "What code, Julian? What is this place?" Julian looked at the screens, his eyes reflecting the flickering static. "This isn't just a surveillance hub, Elena. It's an inheritance. One your father and my father built together to hide something much larger than a company." He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat, but instead of a caress, he pressed his thumb against a hidden biometric scanner on the wall behind her. A hidden wall slid back, revealing a vault filled with rows of black hard drives and stacks of gold bullion. "The war isn't over, Elena," Julian said, his gaze finally meeting hers. There was a flicker of the man she loved there, but it was overshadowed by a terrifying mission. "It's just moved underground. And now that you've seen this, you can never leave. Not for my sake. For yours." From the shadows of the vault, a phone began to ring. It was a burner phone sitting on a pedestal. Julian picked it up. He listened for a moment, his face turning pale. He handed the phone to Elena. "It's for you," he said. Elena took the phone, her hand trembling. "Hello." "Elena," a voice whispered, a voice she hadn't heard in 2 decades. "Don't trust him. He didn't bring you there to protect you. He brought you there to be the key." The line went dead. Elena looked at Julian, the man she had shared her bed and her heart with for 6 months. The man she thought she knew. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Welcome to the real Vane family, Elena. I hope you're ready to play the next move." Outside, the wind howled through the Blackwood forest, cutting off the lodge from the rest of the world. The mystery was no longer about who stole a company. It was about who was truly running the world they lived in. The silence in the basement was absolute, broken only by the hum of the servers and the frantic thudding of Elena's heart. She looked at the phone in her hand, then at Julian. The man who had been her enemy, then her lover, and was now a stranger once again. "That was my mother's voice," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "She died 20 years ago. You told me she died in the same accident as my uncle." Julian didn't flinch. He walked to the main console, his fingers flying across a transparent glass keyboard. "They didn't die, Elena. They disappeared. They were the architects of a global ledger. A system that tracks every bribe, every shadow deal, and every drop of blood spilled for profit in this city. Your father and mine were just the custodians. But your mother, she was the creator." He turned the screen toward her. It wasn't just surveillance. It was a map of power, a digital constellation where every light represented a life they could ruin or save with a single keystroke. "The marriage wasn't just about a grudge," Julian said, stepping into her personal space. "The biometric lock on the final drive. It doesn't just need Vane DNA. It needs a Sterling. It needs you. So I'm just a key to you," she spat, the betrayal cutting deeper than any of his previous lies. All of it. The nights in the library, the promises, the new life. It was all to get me to this basement? Julian reached out, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was desperate, almost pleading. "I fell in love with the key, Elena. That wasn't the plan. But the people who are coming for this ledger, they don't care about love. They've been hunting your mother for 2 decades and now they know you're here." A dull thud echoed from the floor above. The heavy iron door of the lodge had been breached. Julian didn't waste another second. He grabbed a small silver drive from the console and shoved it into Elena's hand. "This is the decryption. If they get me, you run. There's a tunnel behind the server rack. It leads to the old mine shaft. There's a car waiting at the trailhead." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her hatred and love warring in her chest. "You have to," Julian hissed, his eyes darting to the security monitors. Dark figures were already moving through the grand hall upstairs. "You're the only one who can turn this system off. You're the only one who can end the cycle our fathers started." He leaned in, kissing her one last time, a hard, frantic goodbye that tasted of salt and wood smoke. "I destroyed your world once, Elena. Let me save it today." He pushed her toward the hidden tunnel and turned to face the stairs, drawing a sleek black handgun from beneath the desk. The cold, predatory shark was back, but this time he was hunting for her. Elena scrambled into the darkness of the tunnel, the stone walls closing in around her. As she ran, she heard the first shots ring out above, the sharp, violent cracks of a world ending. She didn't look back. Minutes later, she burst out into the cold night air of the forest. The SUV was there, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the mist. She jumped into the driver's seat, the silver drive clutched in her hand. She looked at the lodge on the hill. A small explosion rocked the foundation, orange flames licking the gray stone. She waited for Julian to emerge from the smoke. 1 minute. 2. The forest remained silent. Elena looked at the drive, then at the road leading back to the city. She wasn't the woman who had walked down the aisle in ivory silk 6 months ago. She wasn't a victim and she wasn't just a trophy. She put the car in gear and floored it. Whether Julian was alive or dead, the Vanes and the Sterlings were finished. He had the ledger. He had the power. And for the first time in her life, Elena was the one holding the gun to the world's head. As the lodge burned in her rearview mirror, her phone buzzed one last time. A text from the same unknown number. The key is turned. Now let's begin.